They say the truth will set you free. But first, it will get you fired. My name is Nora Bennett. I spent 15 years building stories that mattered. Stories that exposed corruption, held power accountable, and gave voice to people who had none. Then one night, during a live broadcast watched by hundreds of thousands, my microphone went dead. Not by accident, not by technical error, by design. This is what happened when I refused to stay silent. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button. Because what comes next is a story about power, betrayal, and what it costs to tell the truth when the people in charge would rather you didn't. But the truth didn't start that night. It started 3 weeks earlier when I found out what silence really costs. The red light blinked on at exactly 9 p.m. I had done this 1,000 times before. Maybe more. The studio was cold the way television studios always are. The air conditioning set too high to compensate for the heat of the lights. The room smelled like coffee. Gone stale, and old carpet that had absorbed 15 years of tension. Graham Porter, my news director and the man who had hired me 8 years ago, stood behind the glass partition of the control room. His arms were crossed over his chest. His face looked like it had been carved from stone. Something felt wrong. The kind of wrong you feel in your stomach before your mind catches up. Ryan Cross, the young anchor I had personally trained for the past 6 months, sat beside me at the curved news desk. He smiled at camera one, his teeth impossibly white under the studio lights. His suit was navy blue, freshly pressed. Probably bought with his first real paycheck. I had written every single word that scrolled across the teleprompter. In front of us, every fact, every transition, every carefully chosen phrase. The floor director, a woman named Jenna who had been with us for a decade, counted down with her fingers. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ryan said, breaking news tonight from City Hall. A corruption scandal that reaches the highest levels of municipal government and implicates one of the city's most powerful businessmen. I waited for my cue. My mouth was dry. I had spent 3 weeks investigating this story. 21 days of following paper trails, conducting interviews, verifying sources. I had the documents locked in my office safe. I had recorded testimonies from 3 city employees who were risking their jobs to speak up. I had bank records showing transfers that shouldn't exist. I had everything, but my microphone stayed silent. I tapped it twice with my finger. Nothing, not even a whisper of static. I said, check my channel. No one moved. The silence was a choice. I looked up at Graham through the glass. His eyes met mine. He stared back without expression, without movement, without any signal to the audio technician, who sat 2 feet away from him. Ryan kept talking, his voice the only sound in the room. Ryan said, our senior investigative team has uncovered evidence of bid rigging, contract manipulation, and undisclosed payments, totaling over $12 million. My story, my words, my investigation, my 3 weeks of missed dinners, and late nights and phone calls with frightened sources who trusted me to protect them. But only Ryan's voice carried through the airwaves to living rooms across the city. I felt heat rise up my neck. My hands started to shake. I pressed them flat against the desk to stop the tremor. I looked at Jenna. She was staring at me with wide eyes. Her head set slightly crooked, her mouth forming a silent question I couldn't answer. I stood up. You don't stand up during a live broadcast. You don't break the invisible contract between anchor and viewer. You don't disrupt the carefully choreographed dance of television news. In 15 years, I had never broken protocol. Not once. But I did it that night. The camera operator, Marcus, actually took a step backward. His professional mask cracked for just a second, revealing genuine shock. The studio camera felt like a living thing, its red light staring at me like an accusation. Graham's voice crackled in my earpiece, harsh and final. Graham said, sit down, Nora. Right now. This is your last warning. I reached up slowly. I pulled the earpiece out. It came free with a soft pop. I let it dangle from its wire. I looked directly at camera 2, the one that feeds to the main broadcast. I opened my mouth to speak, to tell the viewers what was happening, to expose the corruption happening. Not in City Hall but right here in this newsroom. And the feed cut to commercial. Just like that. A car dealership ad filled screens across the city. But the studio lights stayed on. The cameras kept rolling on their internal feeds. Nobody moved. The moment stretched out like pulled taffy, thin and fragile and about to break. Eli Ward, our head cameraman for the past 10 years, lowered his equipment slowly. His weathered hands were careful, deliberate. Lila Torres, my writer and the closest thing I had to a best friend at the station, stood frozen in the doorway that led to the editing bays. Her hand was still on the door handle. Her face had gone pale. Graham walked onto the studio floor. His shoes clicked against the tile with measured, deliberate steps. Each footfall echoed. He stopped exactly 3 feet from where I stood. Close enough that I could see the tight line of his jaw. Far enough that no one could claim he was being physically aggressive. The studio was completely silent. 20 people holding their breath. Graham said, "You're done here." 4 words. 15 years of work. Gone. I looked at him. Really looked at him. I saw the man who had promoted me to senior producer. The man who had approved my investigations into housing, fraud and environmental violations. The man I had once respected. And I saw something else. Something harder. Something that had been there all along, maybe, hiding beneath the surface. I didn't cry. My eyes stayed dry. I didn't shout. My voice stayed locked behind my teeth. I didn't beg or explain or defend. I just walked away. My heels clicked across the studio floor. Past camera 3. Past the news desk where my notes still sat. Past Ryan, who wouldn't meet my eyes. Past Jenna, whose hand was pressed against her mouth. Past the control room where Graham had already returned to his position behind the glass. I walked into the hallway. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere a printer was churning out scripts for the 10 p.m. show. Even silence can be defiance. He turned off my mic. He forgot I still had a voice. At 3 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon, everything still made sense. The newsroom hummed with its usual controlled chaos. Phones rang in clusters, creating a symphony of urgency. Keyboards clattered like rain on windows. Someone had burned popcorn in the break room again. And the acrid smell had drifted through the ventilation system, mixing with coffee and printer toner and the particular scent of deadline pressure. I sat in my office, a glass box that gave me a view of the entire floor. Reviewing raw footage from our investigative unit. Victor Lang's face filled my computer screen. Victor Lang was the advertising tycoon who owned half the billboards in the city. Maybe more. His company, Lang Enterprises, had its fingers in construction contracts, real estate development, and city planning initiatives. For 3 months, I had been following a trail of suspicious payments. Money that flowed from his companies to shell corporations, then disappeared into offshore accounts, then reappeared in the form of campaign contributions and consulting fees. The evidence was damning. It was also dangerous. Lila knocked on my door frame. She didn't wait for me to answer before walking in. That was Lila. Direct. Efficient. Loyal. Lila said, "You need to see this. Now." She handed me a manila folder, the old-fashioned kind we still kept around for sensitive material that shouldn't exist in digital form. Inside were copies of emails. Not forwarded. Printed directly from a server. The kind of access that required either high-level permissions or significant risk. The emails were between Victor Lang and someone inside our station. The language was coded but not code enough. They discussed story timing using phrases like editorial windows. They discussed content control using terms like narrative management. They discussed money using words like partnership investments. I said, "Show me one line that isn't about money." Lila said, "There isn't one." I felt my stomach turn cold. I said, "Who's the recipient?" Lila closed my office door. The newsroom noise dampened to a murmur. Lila said, "The emails are addressed to Graham, my boss, the man I had worked under for 8 years, the man who had promoted me twice, the man who had once told me that editorial independence was the backbone of everything we did, the man who had promised me, explicitly, that no advertiser would ever influence our coverage." I read through every page. The dates went back 6 months. January, February, March, April, May, June. A paper trail of corruption that showed Victor Lang was essentially buying our silence. Or worse, buying our cooperation. Paying for stories to be softened, delayed, or killed entirely. I closed the folder. My hands left damp prints on the manila surface. I looked up at Lila. I said, "We run the investigation anyway." Lila sat down in the chair across from my desk. Lila said, "Nora, if Graham is compromised, he'll kill the story before it reaches air." I said, "Then we document everything. We make it impossible for him to bury it without leaving fingerprints." Lila said, "And if he does it anyway?" I said, "Then we go around him. We go to the network. We go to the ethics board. We go somewhere." But even as I said it, I felt the doubt creeping in. The tightness in my chest that comes when you realize the system you trusted might be broken. That evening, I stayed late. The newsroom emptied out in waves. The 6 p.m. team wrapped and left. The production assistants clocked out. The cleaning crew came through with their carts and vacuum cleaners, earbuds in, focused on their own work. By 8 p.m., I was alone on the floor except for the overnight security guard and the dim glow of emergency exit signs. I sat at my desk compiling everything. Documents arranged chronologically. Interviews transcribed and cross-referenced. Financial records highlighted and annotated. Bank transfers traced through 3 holding companies. Shell corporations registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. A web of corruption that connected Victor Lang to at least 4 city council members, 2 planning commissioners, and a dozen contractors. At 8 p.m. exactly, Graham appeared in my doorway. I hadn't heard him coming. The carpet absorbed sound. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his tie loosened, looking like a man at the end of a long day. But his eyes were alert. Graham said, "Working late?" I minimized my screen. A reflex. Protection. I said, "Just finishing up research." Graham said, "The Victor Lang piece?" My throat went dry. I had not told him the target's name. I had been careful. Paranoid, even. I had kept my notes locked up. I had used vague project names in my calendar. I had told only Lila and Eli. I said, "How did you know?" Graham smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who holds all the cards and wants you to know it. Graham said, "I'm the news director, Nora. I know everything that happens in this building. Every story, every source, every angle." He paused in the doorway. The fluorescent light from the hallway created a silhouette around him. Graham said, "Be careful with this one. Victor Lang is a complicated man. Powerful friends. Deep pockets. The kind of story that can hurt a lot of people if it's not handled correctly." I said, "Then we'll handle it correctly." Graham said, "I'm sure you will." He left without another word. His footsteps faded down the hallway. A door opened and closed somewhere. Then silence. I said, "If he knows, he's watching. If he's watching, he's planning." I sat alone in the dark. The city lights blinked through my window, 1,000 small lives in 1,000 small boxes. I had spent 15 years believing in journalism, in truth, in accountability, in the idea that sunlight was the best disinfectant and that our job was to turn on the lights. Now I wasn't sure who I could trust. At 7:30 that night, I decided to test what kind of truth my newsroom could handle. This was how they stole it from me, in broad daylight. The next morning, I arrived at 6 a.m. The building was quiet except for the hum of servers in the basement and the distant sound of the loading dock crew unloading equipment. The newsroom was empty except for the morning show producers hunched over their computers, triple-checking scripts, and the coffee machine gurgling in the break room. I went straight to my office. My laptop was exactly where I had left it. My files appeared untouched. The physical documents were still locked in my desk drawer. Or so I thought. At 9:30 a.m., Graham called an all-staff meeting. His assistant sent out the notification with 15 minutes notice. Mandatory attendance. Everyone gathered in the main conference room, the one with windows overlooking the street and a table that could seat 30. Ryan Cross sat at Graham's right hand. That was new. Ryan usually sat with the other junior anchors, the ones still learning how to modulate their voices and hold eye contact with the camera. Graham stood at the head of the table. He waited until everyone had settled, until the room had gone completely quiet. The air felt tight. Graham said, "I want to announce a major investigative piece we'll be running next Monday night. Prime time. Lead story." My heart sank. I felt it drop into my stomach. Graham said, "Ryan Cross has been working on an investigation of municipal corruption. It involves Victor Lang and several city officials. Bid rigging, contract fraud, offshore accounts. It's exemplary journalism, the kind of work that defines what we do here." The room erupted. People clapped. Someone whistled. Colleagues reached over to shake Ryan's hand, to pat his shoulder. Congratulations echoed around the table. Ryan stood up halfway, embarrassed but pleased, basking in the attention. Lila looked at me across the table. Her face had gone pale. Her eyes asked a question I couldn't answer yet. Ryan sat down. He cleared his throat. The room quieted to hear him speak. Ryan said, "Thank you all. I've spent months on this investigation. Late nights, difficult sources, complex financial documents. I'm proud of what we've uncovered. I'm proud to work alongside all of you." Lies. Every word was a carefully constructed lie. I stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. The sound cut through the congratulatory murmur like breaking glass. The room went quiet again, but this time the silence was different. Uncomfortable. Waiting. I said, "Graham, can I speak with you privately?" Graham looked at me. His expression didn't change. Graham said, "Anything you need to say can be said here. We're all colleagues. We're all on the same team." I felt every eye in the room turn toward me. 28 people. Some I had worked with for a decade. Some I had hired myself. Some I barely knew. All of them watching, waiting to see what I would do. I had two choices: stay silent or burn everything down. I said, "That investigation is mine. I've been working on it since January. Ryan has had nothing to do with it. He hasn't conducted a single interview. He hasn't verified a single source. He hasn't written a single word." The room temperature seemed to drop. Someone coughed. Papers rustled. Ryan's face flushed red, a crimson tide that started at his collar and rose to his hairline. Ryan said, "That's not true. That's completely false. I've been developing this story independently for months. I have my own sources. My own documents." I said, "Then tell me about the shell company." His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The room held its breath. I said, "Tell me the name. Tell me where it's registered." Ryan's lips moved but no sound followed. I said, "Tell me about the planning department emails. Who sent them? What dates? What did they say?" A pen rolled off the table. It hit the floor with a small plastic click. Nobody moved to pick it up. Ryan said, "I don't have to prove anything to you." I said, "Tell me about the offshore account. Which bank? Which country? How much money passed through it?" Ryan looked at Graham. It was a desperate look. A plea for rescue. Graham stood up. His chair didn't scrape. He pushed it back smoothly, controlled. Graham said, "This is inappropriate, Nora. We can discuss your concerns in private. This is neither the time nor the place." I said, "There's nothing to discuss in private. This is theft. Plain and simple. Those are my sources, my documents, my investigation, and everyone in this room knows it." I looked around the table. At faces I had shared coffee with, celebrated birthdays with, worked beside during breaking news and natural disasters and election nights. Not one person met my eyes. They all looked down, at their phones, at their notebooks, at the wood grain patterns in the table surface. The silence felt like a living thing. Graham said, "Meeting adjourned. Everyone back to work. Nora, my office. Now." We walked in silence through the newsroom. 30 desks. 60 eyes watching from behind computer monitors. The production assistants pretended to be busy. The writers stared at their screens. The assignment editor suddenly became very interested in the police scanner. Graham closed his office door. He didn't sit down. He stood with his back to the window, backlit by morning sun, his face in shadow. Graham said, "You're making a serious mistake." I said, "The only mistake I made was trusting you." Graham said, "Victor Lang brings in $600,000 in advertising revenue annually. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand what happens to this station if we run a story that causes him to pull his contracts?" I said, "We do our jobs." Graham said, "We lose funding. We lay off 20 people. Good people. People with families, mortgages, kids in college. The station struggles. Ratings drop. Maybe we close entirely. Is that what you want?" My hands were shaking. I pressed them against my sides. I said, "So we trade the truth for money? We trade accountability for comfortable budget meetings?" Graham said, "We trade idealism for survival. We trade one story for the ability to tell 100 others." That's the calculation. That's the reality of modern journalism. I felt something crack inside me. Not my resolve, my illusions. The belief that the people I worked for shared my values. I said, I'm running the story. With or without your approval. I'll go to the network. I'll go to the ethics board. I'll go public if I have to. Graham said, no, you're not. I said, you can't stop me. Graham's face hardened. The shadow across his features seemed to deepen. Graham said, I can. And I will. You're suspended pending internal review. 2 weeks. Effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. You'll surrender your credentials and your access cards. You will not contact current staff. You will not access company resources. You will not speak to the press. The words hit me like physical blows. I said, you're suspending me for doing journalism? Graham said, I'm suspending you for insubordination and violating company policy. The review will determine if there are grounds for termination. He opened the door. The conversation was over. His secretary was already standing there with a security guard. A man named Paul who had smiled at me every morning for 8 years. He wouldn't look at me now. I walked out of Graham's office. I walked past my desk. I walked past Lila, who had tears in her eyes. Past Eli, who shook his head slowly. Past every colleague I had worked beside for years. Nobody said a word. They just watched me go. But Lila followed me to the elevator. She waited until we were alone. The doors were closing when she slipped inside, pushing past the security guard's half-hearted protest. Lila said, I'm with you. Whatever you do next, wherever this goes, I'm with you. The elevator descended. 15 floors. I counted every one. Those words kept me breathing for the next 2 weeks. But invisibility is not the same as silence. I finally understood what it meant to be invisible in your own newsroom. 2 weeks later, they aired my investigation without me. Suspension was a kind of quiet drowning. Slow, heavy, inevitable. For 14 days, I stayed in my apartment. I watched my own station betray everything I believed in. I watched Graham's news team soften my investigation into something toothless. I watched Ryan Cross become a rising star on the back of my work. Ryan ran the story on a Wednesday night. The 9 p.m. broadcast. Prime time. I sat on my couch in sweatpants and an old college tee. On my screen his face filled the frame. Each softened word scraped across me like sandpaper. My jaw clenched. I did not blink. Ryan said, tonight we bring you an investigation into questions surrounding city contracts and the business practices of Victor Lang, a prominent local entrepreneur. Questions, not accusations, not evidence, just questions carefully chosen to sound harmless. The story lasted 12 minutes. It mentioned Victor Lang but did not expose him. It referenced city officials but did not name them. It alluded to offshore accounts but did not reveal amounts or locations. It was journalism without teeth. Truth without consequence. The illusion of accountability without any real power. My phone rang constantly. Other reporters who had heard rumors. Friends asking what happened. Sources calling to ask why. Their courage had been wasted on a story that changed nothing. I didn't answer. What could I say? That I had tried? That I had been silenced? That the system had protected itself? Then came the call I was dreading. Adam Porter came home early from work. On the Thursday of my second week suspended. He found me on the couch watching the news. His father's station. His father's choice. His father's version of truth. Adam set his briefcase down carefully. The latches clicked. He loosened his tie. Adam said, Graham called me today. I muted the television. I said, what did he say? Adam said, he's worried about you. He thinks you're making this personal. He thinks you're not seeing the bigger picture. I laughed. It was a bitter sound that surprised both of us. I said, it is personal. He stole my work. He covered up corruption. He chose advertising revenue over truth. How is that not personal? Adam sat down on the other end of the couch. 3 feet of space between us that felt like miles. He rubbed the back of his neck. He looked at his hands, not at me. Adam said, this is hard for me, Nora. He's my father. I know he's not perfect, but he's not a villain. He's just trying to keep the station alive. I said, and I'm your wife. Adam said, I know. But you're asking me to choose between you and him. You're asking me to believe my father is corrupt. I said, I'm not asking you to choose anything. I'm asking you to see what's right. I'm asking you to recognize that some things matter more than family loyalty. Adam said, what's right isn't always what's possible. Sometimes you have to compromise. Sometimes you have to make difficult choices to preserve something worth preserving. We sat in silence. The television flickered without sound. Images of my city, my stories, my life's work reduced to background noise. A siren wailed somewhere outside. The refrigerator hummed. Adam said, "Graham is willing to bring you back. He'll reinstate you if you apologize publicly. If you acknowledge that you handled the situation poorly. If you agree to work within the established editorial process." I stood up. I looked at my husband. The man I had married 5 years ago. In a ceremony at a vineyard overlooking the ocean. The man who had promised to support my dreams. The man who had held my hand through my father's funeral and my promotion to senior producer and every difficult moment in between. I said, "I won't apologize for being a journalist. I won't apologize for telling the truth." Adam said, "Then you might not have a career left. You might not have anything left." I said, "Then I'll build something new." His face changed. Something closed off. A door shutting somewhere deep inside. Adam said, "I can't keep fighting with you about this. I can't keep being caught in the middle." I said, "Then don't be in the middle. Take a side." Adam said, "It's not that simple." I said, "Yes, it is." He didn't respond. He picked up his briefcase. He walked into our bedroom. He came out 20 minutes later with a packed bag. The zipper sounded loud in the quiet. Adam said, "I'm going to stay at my brother's for a while. We both need space to think." He left. The door closed quietly. No slam. No drama. Just the soft click of a lock engaging. I stood in our living room. Now just my living room, and tried to feel something other than numb. That night, I called Diane Walsh. She was head of legal at the station. We had worked together on compliance issues, source protection agreements, and defamation reviews. She was smart, careful, and ethical. The phone rang 3 times. Each ring sounded louder than the last. Diane said, "Nora, I'm glad you called. I quit this morning." I said, "What?" Diane said, "I can't be part of what Graham's doing. I've been documenting everything for weeks. The Victor Lang relationship, the editorial interference, the retaliation against you. He's violated every principle of journalistic integrity. Worse, he's left the station legally exposed. If the truth comes out, we could face lawsuits from your sources, from advertisers, from regulatory bodies." I said, "The truth will come out." Diane said, "Good. Let me help you." We talked for 2 hours. We made a plan. We identified allies. We prepared for war. The next Monday, my suspension was supposed to end. I arrived at the station at 8 a.m. I had dressed carefully, professional, composed, ready to fight. Security stopped me at the lobby entrance. The guard, a man named Marcus, who had waved me through every morning for 8 years, held up his hand. He hesitated. His eyes slid past me. Marcus said, "Ms. Bennett, I have orders. You're not permitted on the premises." I said, "What orders?" "My suspension ended today." Marcus said, "From Mr. Porter. You've been terminated. Effective immediately. Fired. Not suspended. Not under review. Fired." I stood on the sidewalk outside the building where I had spent 15 years. People rushed past me. Commuters with coffee cups and headphones. Strangers with places to be. Lives to live. Truths to tell. I pulled out my phone. I called every contact I had. Reporters at other stations. Producers I had met at conferences. Editors who had tried to recruit me. Anyone who would listen. By noon, the story was breaking. Not on Graham's station. On every other outlet in the city. Senior producer fired after exposing corruption cover-up. Newsroom in crisis as staff questions editorial independence. Advertising scandal rocks local television station. The walkout was Eli's idea. Eli Ward, the cameraman who never spoke unless he had something important to say, organized it. He sent a group text at 2 p.m. Simple message. No drama. Eli's text said, "We walk out at 3 p.m. Who's with me?" 12 staff members responded yes. 12 people willing to risk their jobs, their paychecks, their careers. They left the building at exactly 3 p.m. They gathered on the sidewalk across from the main entrance. They held signs made from poster board and markers borrowed from the art department. Wind tugged at the edges of the paper. The wind carried their voices down the street, echoing against glass towers. Traffic hummed behind them. Truth over money. Journalism is not for sale. We stand with Nora Bennett. I watched from a coffee shop down the block. I sat at a window table with a cold latte I couldn't drink. Tears finally came, not from sadness, from hope, from the realization that I wasn't alone. That some people still believed in the same things I did. Lila spotted me through the window. She crossed the street, dodging traffic, still holding her sign. She came into the coffee shop and sat down across from me. Lila said, "We got you, Nora. All of us." I thought they had silenced me. But outside those glass walls, the truth had already started to shout. The aftermath was brutal and beautiful in equal measure. Graham's station hemorrhaged credibility like a wound that wouldn't close. Major advertisers pulled their contracts. Viewers switched to competing networks. The story grew beyond local news. National outlets picked it up. Media criticism blogs dissected every angle. Journalism ethics committees launched formal inquiries. But my personal life collapsed. Adam moved out 3 days after the walkout. He didn't call. He didn't come by to talk. He sent me a text message at 11 p.m. on a Thursday. Just one line. Adam's text said, "I can't do this anymore. I'm sorry. 5 years of marriage. 5 years of building a life together. Reduced to 20 characters and a period." I sat in our apartment. Now just my apartment, and tried to feel something other than numb. The walls were too quiet. The rooms were too empty. The silence was so complete I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. And the upstairs neighbor's footsteps and my own heartbeat in my ears. Lila showed up the next morning. With coffee and pastries from the French bakery near her apartment. She didn't knock. She used the spare key I had given her 2 years ago for emergencies. This qualified. Lila said, "You look terrible." I was wearing the same clothes from yesterday. My hair was unwashed. I probably smelled like sadness and stale air. I said, "I feel worse." Lila set the coffee and bag of croissants on my kitchen counter. Lila said, "Good. That means you're still human. That means you're still feeling things." Numb would be worse. We sat on my couch, eating almond croissants and drinking lattes and planning revolution. Lila pulled out her laptop. Lila said, "Diane found something. You need to see it right now." She opened an encrypted email. Inside were screenshots of new messages. Not the coded emails from months ago. New ones. Recent ones. From last week. Graham's email said, "The Bennett problem has been permanently handled. The story has been neutralized. Your investment in the station remains secure. Our partnership continues as planned." Victor Lang's reply said, "Excellent work. The next quarterly payment will be transferred as discussed. 500,000 United States dollars to the account ending in 7734. Proof. Clear, undeniable, legally actionable proof of corruption." I said, "How did Diane get these?" Lila said, "Graham got sloppy. Or maybe he got arrogant. He used his work email for everything. Legal department has access to all company communications for compliance reviews. Diane pulled them before she left." I said, "We need to go public immediately." Lila said, "We will. But first, we need to build something new. Something that can't be corrupted. Something that answers to no one except the truth." She pulled up a website mock-up. Clean design, bold typography, minimalist color scheme, a name across the top in letters that looked carved from light. Truthline. Lila said, "Independent journalism. No corporate owners. No advertisers controlling content. No editorial boards making decisions based on profit margins. Just truth. Just us." I stared at the screen. A new beginning. A second chance. A way forward that I hadn't dared to imagine. I said, "Who would fund something like this?" Lila smiled. It was a genuine smile, the first one I had seen from her in weeks. Lila said, "Funny you should ask. The next day, I met Cassandra Blake in a downtown coffee shop. Not a chain. A local place with exposed brick walls and plants hanging from the ceiling and baristas who remembered your order." Cassandra was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a laptop and a cortado. She stood up when she saw me. She was in her early 40s, I guessed. She wore expensive jeans and a simple white shirt and shoes that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her handshake was firm. Cassandra said, "Nora Bennett, I've been following your story closely. What Graham Porter did is reprehensible. It's unethical. It's corrupt. But more importantly, it's an opportunity." I sat down. I said, an opportunity for what? Cassandra said, to prove that ethical journalism can survive in a digital age. To show that truth is valuable. To demonstrate that people will support independent media if given the chance. To build something better than what we have now. She slid a folder across the table. Inside was a term sheet. Legal language I didn't fully understand. But some numbers were very clear. Funding $2.5 million United States dollars over 2 years. Editorial control 100% with founding team. Investor oversight, financial reporting only. Content decisions, zero investor input. I looked up. I said, this is real? Cassandra said, completely real. I made my fortune in digital media. I know how these platforms work. I know what audiences want. And I know that there's a massive market for journalism that isn't compromised by corporate interests. She leaned forward. Her eyes were intense, focused. Cassandra said, I don't want control. I don't want editorial input. I don't want to shape stories or push agendas. I want impact. I want to fund something that matters. Can you deliver that? I thought about 15 years in corporate news. About compromises I had made. About stories that had been softened or delayed or killed. About phone calls from advertisers and pressure from management and meetings where truth came second to profit. I said, yes, I can deliver that. We shook hands. Truthline was born. Her grip was steady, and for the first time in weeks, my lungs felt full. It wasn't just an offer. It was a lifeline disguised as a business deal. Over the next 6 weeks, we built everything from scratch. Lila handled editorial direction and content strategy. Eli managed production and equipment. Diane covered legal compliance and source protection. 3 more journalists from Graham's station joined us. Then 5 more. Then 2 from competing networks who had heard about what we were building. We rented a small studio downtown. The space was raw and imperfect. Exposed brick walls, high ceilings with visible pipes and ductwork. Windows that let in real sunlight instead of artificial fluorescent glare. It smelled like fresh paint and sawdust and possibility. It felt like freedom, but the real work was still ahead. We had funding. We had a team. We had a mission statement that fit on an index card. Now we needed to prove we could do journalism that mattered. Dr. Evelyn Shaw made that possible. Dr. Shaw was chair of the city's Journalism Ethics Committee, an independent body that reviewed complaints about media organizations. She had been investigating Graham's conduct for 6 weeks. She called me on a Friday afternoon. Her voice was professional but warm. Dr. Shaw said, Miss Bennett, I'd like to formally invite you to testify at our public hearing. We're reviewing the Victor Lang matter and related ethical violations at WKRN News. Your testimony would be invaluable. I said, when? Dr. Shaw said, next Tuesday. 10 a.m. at City Hall. The hearing is public. Media will be present. You'll be under oath. This was it. The chance to expose everything. The corruption. The cover-up. The betrayal. The proof. I said, I'll be there. Dr. Shaw said, bring your evidence. Bring your truth. We're listening now. Finally. The weekend before the hearing, we worked around the clock. Our new studio smelled like fresh paint and ambition and too much coffee. Lila sat at a desk piled with documents, 3 monitors glowing in front of her, her fingers moving across the keyboard like a pianist. Eli adjusted lighting rigs, testing angles and shadows until everything looked exactly right. Diane reviewed legal briefings, making sure every claim we made could be defended in court. We were building our first broadcast. Not for Graham's station, not for corporate media, for ourselves, for the truth, for everyone who believed journalism still mattered. I stood in front of our single camera. The lens stared back at me like an old friend. I had done this 1,000 times. But never like this. Never free. Never independent. Never mine. Lila said, we're recording in 5, 4, 3, 2. She pointed at me. I looked into the camera. I took a breath. I looked at my notes one last time. Then I looked up and spoke directly to whoever would listen. I said, my name is Nora Bennett. 3 months ago, I was fired from WKRN News for refusing to bury a story about corruption. For refusing to let powerful people control what truth gets told. Tonight, I'm here to tell you that story. All of it. No edits. No sponsors. No compromise. No one cutting my microphone or softening my words or protecting the guilty. We recorded for 43 minutes. I laid out everything with the precision of a prosecutor and the passion of someone who had lost everything fighting for it. The documents showing Victor Lang's shell companies. The emails proving Graham's complicity. The offshore accounts containing $12 million in suspicious transfers. The city officials who had taken bribes. The contracts that had been rigged. The cover-up that had protected all of them. It was the story I should have been able to tell months ago. The story that cost me my career and my marriage and everything I thought was stable. When we finished, I looked around the studio. Lila was crying, not dramatically, just tears running down her face while she smiled. Eli was grinning, his usually stoic face cracked open with pride. Diane was already on her phone, drafting press releases and media alerts. Lila said, "This is what journalism looks like. This is what it's supposed to be." We uploaded the broadcast to our new website at exactly midnight. No advertising budget, no marketing campaign, no corporate backing, just a link shared on social media and a prayer that someone would care. By 8 a.m., we had 50,000 views. By noon, 100,000. By 5 p.m., 500,000. The notification chime became a metronome. By the time I went to bed at 2 a.m., we had passed 1 million. The story spread like wildfire. Social media amplified it. Other journalists cited it. Viewers shared it with everyone they knew. Comment sections filled with support and anger and demands for accountability. We had touched a nerve. People were hungry for truth. For journalism without corporate interference. For stories that mattered more than profit margins. For proof that independent media could survive. The red light on our camera never blinked. Neither did I. For the first time, corruption had a name. And it was one everyone recognized. The Ethics Committee hearing was held Tuesday morning in the City Council chambers at City Hall. The room was built for authority. Stone columns rose to a vaulted ceiling. Dark wood paneling absorbed light. High windows let in morning sun that cut through the space in angled beams. The public gallery was packed. Reporters filled the front rows. Cameras set up on tripods, microphones clustered on the witness table. City officials sat in the back. Concerned citizens filled every available seat. Some people stood against the walls. Graham sat at the respondents' table, wearing an expensive charcoal suit and a red tie. His face was calm, composed. He looked like a man confident in his defense. Ryan sat beside him in a navy suit that matched his anchor wardrobe. They both had lawyers, teams of them. Legal pads covered the table. I sat in the witness waiting area with Diane. My hands were shaking. I pressed them together to stop the tremor. Diane said, "Just tell the truth. That's all you have to do. The evidence speaks for itself." Dr. Evelyn Shaw called the hearing to order at exactly 10 a.m. She was a black woman in her 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She wore reading glasses on a chain and spoke with quiet authority. Dr. Shaw said, "We are convened to examine allegations of ethical violations, editorial misconduct, and corruption involving WKRN News and its director, Graham Porter. This is a formal proceeding. All testimony will be given under oath. Let's begin." She called me first. I walked to the witness table. My heels clicked against the marble floor. Every eye in the room followed me. I raised my right hand. I swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth. Then I sat down in a chair that felt too small for the moment. Dr. Shaw said, "Ms. Bennett, please describe your role at WKRN News and the events that led to your termination." I took a breath. I looked at Graham. He stared back without expression. Then I told them everything. Paper rasped under my fingers as each exhibit slid into the record. For 90 minutes, I presented evidence. I entered documents into the record. Emails showing Graham's relationship with Victor Lang. Financial records proving payments from Lang Enterprises to Graham's personal accounts. Correspondence demonstrating editorial interference. Testimony from sources who had been silenced. The timeline of how Graham had stolen my investigation. Sanitized it, given it to Ryan, and then fired me when I objected. Graham's lawyer tried to interrupt. Tried to object. Tried to paint me as a disgruntled employee with a grudge. But the evidence didn't care about narrative. It just existed. Undeniable. Documented. Dated and signed and backed up on multiple servers. When I finished, the room was silent. You could hear the heating system. Someone's phone vibrating, the scratch of pen on paper as reporters took notes. Dr. Shaw looked at Graham over her reading glasses. Dr. Shaw said, "Mr. Porter, do you wish to respond to these allegations?" Graham stood slowly. He adjusted his tie. He looked directly at me with eyes that showed no emotion. No regret. No shame. Nothing. Graham said, "Ms. Bennett is a talented journalist who became personally invested in a story beyond the bounds of professional objectivity. Her allegations are based on misunderstandings and mischaracterizations of normal business operations. I acted in the best interests of the station, our staff, and our community. Every decision I made was designed to preserve jobs and maintain our ability to serve the public. I didn't react. I sat perfectly still. I had learned that silence could be its own form of testimony." Dr. Shaw said, "Mr. Porter, these documents show payments from Victor Lang to accounts in your name. Can you explain these transactions?" Graham said, "Consulting fees. Perfectly legal. Disclosed to the appropriate parties. Unrelated to editorial decisions." Dr. Shaw said, "The emails suggest otherwise. They explicitly connect payment to editorial control." Graham said, "Emails can be taken out of context." Dr. Shaw said, "I see. We'll return to this. Ms. Walsh, you're next." Diane Walsh took the witness chair. She presented legal documentation of Graham's violations. Contracts he had broken. Corporate policies he had ignored. Federal communications regulations he had skirted. She spoke for 40 minutes. With the precision of someone who had spent months documenting everything. Then Lila testified. She described the newsroom culture. The fear. The self-censorship. The unspoken understanding that certain stories were forbidden. She entered internal memos showing Graham's interference in multiple investigations, not just mine. Eli testified. He described the technical aspects of how my microphone was deliberately disabled during the live broadcast, how he had been ordered not to intervene, how the feed was cut the moment I stood up. By 1 p.m., Graham's defense was shredded. Dr. Shaw called Ryan Cross to the stand. Ryan walked to the witness table like a man going to his execution. His confidence from the staff meeting was gone. He looked young, scared, caught. Dr. Shaw said, "Mr. Cross, did you conduct the Victor Lang investigation independently as you claimed?" Ryan said, "I was involved in the investigation process." Dr. Shaw said, "That's not what I asked. Did you conduct it independently?" Ryan said, "I worked with the materials available." Dr. Shaw said, "Materials provided by Ms. Bennett?" Ryan looked at Graham. Graham stared straight ahead. Ryan said, I received guidance from senior staff." Dr. Shaw said, "Mr. Cross, you're under oath. Did you steal Miss Bennett's work and present it as your own?" The room held its breath. Ryan said, "Yes. One word. The truth." Finally, Dr. Shaw said, "Why?" Ryan said, "Because Mr. Porter told me to. Because he said it was my opportunity. Because I wanted to advance my career. Because I didn't think about what it would cost." His voice broke on the last word. Dr. Shaw said, "This committee finds your testimony lacking in credibility and character. We will be recommending sanctions. You're dismissed." Ryan walked out of the chamber with his head down. His lawyers followed. The door closed behind them. Graham was recalled to the stand. Dr. Shaw asked him question after question, each one more pointed than the last. His answers became shorter, more defensive, less convincing. At 3 p.m., Dr. Shaw adjourned the hearing. She said the committee would issue formal findings within 1 week. I left City Hall at 3:30 p.m. The sun was bright. The air was cold. Late autumn in a city I had covered for 15 years. I stood on the stone steps and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Not victory yet. Not vindication. Just peace. The knowledge that I had told the truth. That I had fought for what mattered. That I hadn't compromised. 1 week later, Dr. Shaw released the committee's findings. The press conference was held at 10 a.m. Cameras from every local station. National networks too. Dr. Shaw stood at a podium with the committee seal behind her. Dr. Shaw said, after extensive review, "This committee finds that Graham Porter violated professional ethics standards, engaged in corrupt practices, and deliberately retaliated against a journalist for performing her duties. He is banned from practicing journalism for 5 years. WKRN News is fined $50,000 and required to implement comprehensive ethical reforms. Ryan Cross receives a 1-year suspension and permanent notation. On his professional record, she paused, looked directly at the cameras. Dr. Shah said, "Journalism is not a luxury. It's a necessity. When news organizations betray that trust for profit, they betray democracy itself. This decision sends a message. Truth matters more than money. Accountability matters more than comfort. The public deserves better." Victor Lang was charged with bribery 3 days later. 4 city council members resigned. Corruption investigations opened into a dozen contracts. The system, broken as it was, had finally worked. That evening, I stood in our studio at Truthline. The space had grown. We now had 3 cameras, a proper control room with new equipment, an editing bay, a small team of dedicated journalists who believed in the same things I did. Our audience had grown to 3 million across all platforms. We had broken 6 more stories, won 2 awards, proved that ethical journalism could thrive without corporate ownership. Lila stood at the producer's desk. Eli checked camera angles one last time. Diane reviewed our legal compliance checklist. Everything was ready. I adjusted my microphone, the same brand I had used for 15 years. But this one was mine. No one could cut it. No one could silence it. At 7 p.m. exactly, the red light blinked on. I looked into the camera. I smiled. It was a real smile. Genuine. I said, "Good evening. I'm Nora Bennett, and this is Truthline. Tonight, we're bringing you an update on the municipal corruption case that has transformed this city. But more importantly, we're bringing you proof that journalism can survive without compromise. That truth is more valuable than profit. That your voice matters. That accountability is possible." We ran the full investigation that night. Every detail Graham had tried to bury. Every fact he had tried to sanitize. Every truth he had tried to silence. 1 hour of unfiltered, independent journalism, backed by evidence and motivated by nothing except the public's right to know. When the broadcast ended, I sat back in my chair. The studio lights were warm on my face. Lila was grinning from the control room. Eli gave me a thumbs up from behind his camera. My phone buzzed. One message. Adam's text said, "I watched tonight. I'm proud of you. I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to stand with you. You were right all along." I looked at the message for a long time. I thought about our 5 years together. About the choices we make. About what we're willing to sacrifice for truth. About forgiveness and time and the complexity of loving someone who can't see what you see. Maybe someday we would find our way back to each other. Maybe not. But I had learned that some relationships are built on compromise, and some truths are worth standing alone for. I didn't reply. Not yet. Maybe tomorrow. Cassandra Blake called as we were shutting down for the night. Cassandra said, "I just got off the phone with 7 potential investors. Major players. They all want to support what we're building. Truthline is going national. Are you ready?" I looked around our small studio. The exposed brick. The high ceilings. The windows that let in real light. The place where we had started over. Where we had refused to stay silent. I said, "We're ready." 3 months later, Truthline had bureaus in 5 cities. We had broken 11 major stories. We had won 4 journalism awards. We had proved that ethical reporting could thrive. That people would support independent journalism if given the chance. That truth still mattered in an age of corporate media and manufactured consent. I stood in our original studio one last time before we moved to a larger space. This room had become sacred somehow. The place where everything changed. Where I learned that being fired wasn't the end. Where I discovered that losing everything could be the beginning of building something better. I walked to the control board. I looked at the switches and dials and the familiar layout I had memorized. I reached out and flipped the main switch. The on-air light blinked on. Red and steady and true. I thought about that night months ago. Graham cutting my microphone. The silence that followed. The humiliation and anger and fear. How it felt to lose everything. How it felt to be invisible in your own story. But silence, I had learned, is only permanent if you accept it. If you let fear win. If you choose comfort over truth. I had chosen differently. I had chosen to speak anyway. To build something better. To prove that one person standing up could matter. That truth will always find its voice if you're brave enough to keep speaking. They cut my mic once. Now the whole world is listening. If you believe truth always finds its way back on air, share your thoughts in the comments below.